So, Jeff, COVID and COVID origin is back in the news, and it's back in the news for kind of a strange reason, certainly one that I would not have expected. Now, I mean, first off, I should really say the reason why we on this show haven't really talked about it much these past few months is because the debate is over. The thing came out of the Wuhan lab. I mean, what else is there to say? I mean, that in a nutshell is why you haven't heard so much from us on this topic. But now I think this latest news kind of does bring it back to the point where we should talk about it. And that news is that there was a leak at the Wuhan lab in 2014 of a polio virus. And the polio virus was classified as WIV14, which WIV is Wuhan Institute of Virology. 14 is just their designate their number there. So the thing about this polio virus is, of course, polio has been more or less eradicated since the 50s. And this virus, more or less identical in the way that was found in 2014 in some kid in China, that was held, that matched the Wuhan lab one, hence it must have come out of the Wuhan lab. Well, there's another reason why it must have come out of the Wuhan lab is because the same sequence, or more or less the same sequence of that polio virus was already recorded back in the 1950s. So it's not possible for the virus to have not evolved, mutated, changed, or whatever from 1950 to 2014. So the only way that can happen is if it's stored in a lab. And then if it leaks from a lab and infects a child, which is what happened in this case, well, then you get this the situation where basically a child now, or back in 2014, had caught the virus that is actually the virus from the 1950s. So the fact that that happened, or is now, there was a paper on that, a study, I think, and the fact that it hasn't really been objected to by the usual suspects, like, well, lab leaks happen kind of thing. Well, what are the chances that the Wuhan lab did that, and then of course a couple of years later they leaked COVID as well?
It's interesting on a couple fronts. One, as you said, that there's not been a lot of pushback on this. I think there's a certain amount of hope that in all the hubbub of the election, that it just sort of gets, like, the less attention we draw to it, the better. If I remember correctly, the polio that was leaked, it was 99.9% identical to a 1954 virus, which is how they kind of put this together. And Rand Paul, a few days back, a little while ago, recently put out a tweet where he said, the Wuhan Institute of Virology may have leaked the polio virus before they got around to leaking COVID-19. And, I guess you can speak for yourself, but I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, it's another, you and I are already have been firmly convinced that there's no doubt that COVID came out of the Wuhan lab, but it's another, nail in that coffin. And also kind of plays to the security aspects and how much did the Wuhan lab ever learn. It also plays into this overarching issue of the generic danger from lab leaks and the fact that, guess what? Unfortunately, they are a lot more common than people think. At one point, gosh, it's probably been a couple of years now, but you and I went through and tried to put together sort of a list of all the lab leaks that had happened. And we knew there was going to be a lot, but I think we were almost sort of shocked that we kept finding more and more and more, with the attitude of, wow, lab leaks are not an isolated incident. They are actually happen with alarming frequency, all of which making it viable. But you also had a post, which I want you, I don't know, do you have it in front of you? If maybe you can read, if not, I've got it. But you went back and remembered something that had always really, really bothered us. And that was, when we were getting all this information, what was going on, these emails, et cetera, there was an email by Ron Fouchier, and he was in the background talking on Fauci's secret teleconference, and he made a very unusual statement. And since you found this and resurfaced it, why don't I turn it over to you if you've got it?
Yeah, I have it in front of me here. But the email, to be fair, has been around. We've had this email for a number of years, and we reported on it at the time.
We both talked about it, but it has very new relevance.
Very much so. Now that we know that the Wuhan lab leaked this polio virus a few years before it leaked COVID, and again, when I say it leaked, I'm not implying they did so on purpose. We just don't know. All we know is that COVID came out of the Wuhan lab. So now we have another virus. Now, regarding this email, I guess we should just rewind here a bit and just very quickly sum up what the context is. When it became clear that COVID looked engineered, because this was in January of 2020, when some of Fauci's goons looked at this thing in terms of the genetic sequence, and they figured, oh, there's this insert that none of these other viruses have, and it's this thing called furin cleavage site, which we've talked about many, many times. Well, genetically, that's actually a real anomaly. Other than no beta coronavirus has ever had it, just looking at it genetically, this is actually an insertion of genetic material. Like, you basically have to cut the sequence, the A's and C's and G's and so on, and then you have to insert like a bunch of new A's and C's and so on. And this is what happened with COVID. And then as soon as that was spotted by Fauci's goons, Fauci called his secret teleconference among his goons in terms of, what are we going to do about this? This is going to be a big, big problem. And so they discussed it. We don't know what exactly was discussed during the conference because, of course, it was secret. We didn't even know it had taken place until like a year and a half after it had taken place. But eventually we got an email which was sent by this guy you mentioned, Ron Fouchier. Now, Ron Fouchier is one of the godfathers of gain of function. Mm-hmm. We talk about Ralph Baric about being one of the godfathers, and he certainly is for coronavirus. But Ron Fouchier is the godfather of gain of function kind of beyond coronavirus. And he was actually the first one who made that H5N1 virus airborne. That's avian flu back in 2011.
Which is insane when you think upon just that.
That's what kicked off this whole debate about, should we be playing around with these viruses and making them airborne and hence infectious and much easier to spread? That was in 2011. And Obama, to his credit, had this moratorium, said, no, let's not do that. Let's put a pause on it. And then, of course, Fauci circumvented the moratorium by outsourcing the work to places like Wuhan and, that whole story. So Ron Fouchier, of course, has a hugely vested interest in being able to continue his little work here, but also, and this is the important part, in not kind of exposing the dangers and what has already happened in the past. So I suppose there must have been some disagreement on the secret teleconference in exactly how to approach the topic. So that some were like, well, yeah, it doesn't matter if it came out of a lab. We can never, ever talk about that. And others might have said, well, we're going to have to find a way to wiggle our way through it. I'm sure there was some disagreement just based on this email that Ron Fouchier wrote. So Ron Fouchier wrote this email shortly after, like a few hours after they all hung up on the teleconference. And in that email, he says that if we were to now talk about COVID as a lab leak, well, then people are going to assume that all these other previous outbreaks were also caused by lab leaks. And that would not be a good thing. And then he goes on to say that if that were to happen, there would be regulations and there would be biosafety and all those kinds of things they all do not want to happen.
And the important issue there was this hint that, up till then, you're kind of thinking they're just trying to protect the fact that they had engineered the virus and they didn't want that to come forth. And as you said, that's what kicked everything into high gear, is like, wow, there's a furin cleavage site here. What the hell is that doing? This thing looks engineered. That's what kicked everything into high gear, got Fauci scrambling. But Fouchier seems to be looking at that and saying, if we're going to put out some of this, we can't put out this information, because if we put out this information, it's going to call into question. He says if we assume a passaging is a possible scenario here, we must assume it is also plausible for all outbreaks from the past. And that is where he said, we can't do this. I don't want to send this out. Dug his heels in, directed the whole group, and indeed, that's what they did. So the point of that is that this transcends just the COVID outbreak, that it raises questions to other outbreaks and to what extent these things actually happen from a lab leak. Now, that might just sound like, Speculation, but unfortunately it's not. Now we know, first of all, there's two things, and I'll get to the second in a moment. But obviously, we now have this new question that it looks very, very plausible that the Wuhan lab leaked out the polio virus back in 2014. But it just so happens that there was another leak that appears to have happened in 2014 that was far more devastating. And that's also something that we've talked a little bit about, and that's the Ebola outbreak that happened in Sierra Leone and New Guinea in 2014. It really became two kind of separate outbreaks, or an outbreak that crescendoed, subsided, and then picked up again. And it just so happens that there was a lab that was operating in Sierra Leone right at the heart of that outbreak called the Kanima Lab. And that Kanima Lab just so happened to be run by Robert Gary and Christian Anderson, two of the primary participants on Fauci's teleconference, who used the same playbook that they used for the Ebola outbreak for the COVID outbreak. And of course, they were co-authors on proximal origin, proximal fraud, as you and I like to call it, the document that went to disprove COVID. So we could dive more into that, but the point is, this is sort of peeling back that layer and shining a light on the fact that, whoa, how many times has this actually happened? How many times has the government been aware of a major outbreak emanating from a government-run or government-affiliated lab that they've enacted a cover-up, and with COVID, they just weren't able to completely cover it up, try as they might?
Precisely, and also because of the infectiousness, which of course was created in a lab. And then some of these earlier outbreaks, you didn't have that level of infectiousness because they didn't have that level of technology to make it so infectious. I mean, as we just said, I mean, the first time that something really became super infectious in a lab was in 2011, Ron Fouchier, the whole thing with the H5N1 avian flu. So before that, they could play around with this stuff in a lab and it might leak. Someone might cut themselves, someone might, breathe it in, or, a number of ways of getting it, and then carried it out of the lab. But the underlying virus would not be that terrible that, everyone who comes into contact with it is suddenly going to get sick or is suddenly going to die. I mean, there's been many, many examples. You had the Fort Dix outbreak in 1977. That was a form of swine flu. I think a bunch of people died there. They had the Marburg outbreak. That was in 1967 or so. That was a monkey virus, but the outbreak was in Marburg, which is a city in Germany which doesn't have monkeys. So that in itself, I just say that because there's some idiotic zoonati, zoonati being the zoonosis people, like, oh, COVID came from nature, hence zoonosis, right? They're called zoonati online. So some zoonati people said, no, Marburg is natural. Why is it called Marburg then if it's natural, given that there are no monkeys in Marburg? No, it came out of a lab in Marburg, but it only killed, like, I don't know, 7, 8 people or whatever, because again, it was not super infectious at the point where it came out, because it wasn't manipulated to make it infectious. That's only been possible in the past decade or so. That's why we're now at just a totally new crossroads. Whereas, these lab leaks, as you say, that they've happened across the board all the time. If you go back, as what we did back here a few years ago, there were dozens and dozens that we can come up with. But each time, just a few people died, a few people got sick or whatever. It wasn't like this huge deal, and hence probably it wasn't talked about enough. But in a way, well, I'm not going to say it didn't matter, but it didn't matter in the sense of COVID, where it just spreads around the whole world. But that's simply because back then we didn't have the technology to make this stuff super infectious. Now we have both kind of elements that are needed here. We have the possibility of lab leaks, so not only the possibility, the high likelihood, as well as these viruses now being manipulated to make them super transmissible in humans. And those two things put together are just killer.
Yeah, and the COVID was interesting because it was assessed for very early on that, it came out of the Wuhan lab. And I'm not just saying us or other investigators, but I'm also talking State Department determined that in March or April of 2020, right? 3 months into the outbreak. And of course, that was subsumed and covered up. The intelligence community jumped on that. So, think how hard the government fought to keep that information from coming out. They fought tooth and nail from doing that. And it just raises I guess the point that we really want to make is The odds of something coming out of a lab versus something arising zoonotically from transferring from animal to human, those are wildly different. The chances of it coming out of a lab are astronomically higher. And that's something that the media has done a lot to cover up. Astronomically higher than it is transferring zoonotically from animal to human. They're not even close. You just on an odds basis, you should logically always look at a lab as a source of origin versus a zoonosis event. And of course, as you mentioned, we still have the zoonosis guys out there still to this day trying to scramble and prove that, no, it wasn't a lab leak. It's become almost laughable at this point, but they're still trying. But just on a pure odds basis, it's overwhelmingly likely. Any incident, doesn't matter. Any incident is overwhelmingly likely, just based on odds, to have originated from a lab than to have arisen zoonotically.
Especially if it's transmissible in humans, because
That's a very good point.
and that point is never made by pretty much anyone, especially not the media. And I would suspect, 95% of the people don't know this. What I mean is they don't know that any old virus you come across in nature, you can go to a jungle and you can go to, touch monkeys and you can do all these kinds of things, play with pigs and whatever, where all these viruses are supposedly from, you're not going to get sick because those viruses are adapted to those hosts and they're not human and you're human. So it's not going to happen. And the only way it might maybe happen is through a million different lucky circumstances where maybe the virus finds a way into your body. Think of it as a key that doesn't fit. But if you wiggle it enough and some parts break off and so on, maybe one day you'll be able to open it. And if you, like the workers in China who were in those bat caves, cleaning up those bat caves, they were just inundated with these viruses, billions and millions and millions. And eventually, one of them got in and then the workers got sick. But again, that's the key that kind of doesn't fit, but eventually gets in. But they weren't able to pass it on because the way it got in was such a lucky circumstance of many different things coming together, starting with being overwhelmed by millions of these viruses. You get to the point where it's not going to be transmissible. They're not going to pass it on to someone else. And for instance, the people who treated the workers back in China I think it was this Mojang mine 2012, they did not get sick.
Nope.
Because so
those workers got very sick, but there was no expansion of that disease. That was it. It was isolated to those workers and done.
That's right. So yes, zoonosis does happen, but it's very rare. And if and when it does happen, it then doesn't lead to a worldwide outbreak because the virus is not adapted to humans. Because the very nature of zoonosis is that it is not adapted to humans. And by the way, the same thing happened with SARS-1. I mean, some people, I think they've taken this too far. I mean, some people said, oh, maybe SARS-1 also leaked out of a lab, I guess anything is possible. But I mean, just let's look at the numbers. SARS-1 it took a long time to get into a human. It took months and months and months, again, because of the key that doesn't fit. And it then had some random mutations, and then through some various other mechanisms, we don't have to get into all the details here, but basically the toilet systems within these big blocks of flats, and there were some gaps, and this thing spread through there, and it was a lot of bad circumstances that came together. And in the end, worldwide, I think you had about 700 deaths. I think 774, something like that. And I think that was the number. So again, when you look at zoonosis, yes, it does happen, but it usually doesn't have a catastrophic outcome because the virus has not been adapted to humans. And that's exactly what happened in COVID, that it was adapted to humans, pre-adapted. And no one ever talks about that part. It's just so obvious. Even if you knew nothing about furin cleavage sites and Wuhan labs, and you knew nothing about the cover-up, and we haven't even talked about WIV-15. We should talk about WIV-15 here in a moment. Anyway, if you knew nothing about any of those things, the mere fact that it was pre-adapted for human transmission in and of itself tells you that it must have come out of a lab.
Well, you mentioned the key, and obviously you were just alluding to it, but if anybody's not clear, the furin cleavage site was the key. It's what made that virus uniquely adaptable to attach to humans. That was the whole point. That inserted furin cleavage site was uniquely adapted to work with humans. That's what made COVID so virulent and let it spread so quickly, is because that furin cleavage site that was the key. It locked into humans. I
What it
still keep
does
coming.
is it triggers. Furin is something we have in our body. The furin cleavage site triggers the furin to cut into the cell. So basically, it's using one of something that's already existing in the body as a kind of a scissors to get in. And again, without the furin cleavage site, the furin isn't activated. There is no cutting, and the thing cannot get in the cell.
Yep. I want to go back briefly to the Kanema example, because that highlights kind of it's a replicant story. It's very parallel to what happened with COVID. So we know that the Kanema lab, it was operating in Sierra Leone, right adjacent to New Guinea as well, back in that time frame, and we know they were working on hemorrhagic viruses. And Gary has denied that they were working with Zaire Ebola, that's the most dangerous strain of Ebola. But subsequently, Christian Anderson admitted that, yes, they were. We had a lot of other data to show that they were, but Gary had denied it. Christian Anderson subsequently admitted that, yes, they actually were working with the Zaire Ebola. Problem with that is the closest origination source for the Zaire Ebola is 2,000 miles away in the Congo. The explanation that was given for how that virus got to that particular point, right surrounding the Kanema lab's dead center to the outbreak, is that it was, guess what? Fruit bats. Fruit bats had migrated from 2,000 miles away to the Kanema lab site and had miraculously spread this to a little boy at a tree in a little grove, kind of in semi-jungle. And that's the story as to how it came about. That story was told by Christian Anderson. He did a number of presentations trying to prove that that's the way it happened. Of course, they did exactly the same thing. How do we get the COVID virus, if it didn't arise from a lab? How did it originate in Wuhan? Well, it was bats that migrated. Now, there's a big problem with both stories, not only the distance, but the fact that there was no diseases that arose in the vast distance, which is almost equidistant. I think a little over 1,200 miles in Wuhan and almost 2,000 in Africa. So the sources were extremely different. And, there's now a lot of people that indeed are pretty convinced, and I'm one of them, that the Kanema lab was indeed the leaker of the conditions at that lab were atrocious, far worse than the Wuhan conditions, even their
Well, and
BSL-2.
isn't it so telling? I mean, obviously, you explained the parallels of the stories here. Isn't it so telling that Robert Gary and Christian Anderson, the two people who were entangled right at the center of the Kanema lab scandal, were the ones who were called by Fauci to make the COVID problem go away? They were his goons. He brought them in from day one. They were there on the secret teleconference. These two guys. By the way, Christian Anderson had nothing to do with COVID viruses. If you look at his portfolio, his authorship, his research, nothing at all as of January of 2020. And suddenly he is the point man on Fauci's secret teleconference. I mean, it's a perfect fit. Obviously, Fauci bringing these guys in because they have experience not with coronaviruses and certainly not Anderson, but they have experience with covering up lab leaks.
They were successful in covering up a lab leak. And secondarily, there's the issue of you've got leverage. Hey, implicitly, we know this happened. We need you over here. We need you to run the same playbook again. And I don't care if you want to do it, you're going to do it. And that's what happened.
Right. I mentioned WIV-15 earlier. I think that was something else. I mean, we've known about this for a while, but the whole polio story, the recent one about WIV-14, that being the polio virus. Again, WIV is Wuhan Institute of Virology. WIV-15 kind of that came back up into the discussion, not a broad discussion, not in the media or anything like that, but just among a small group of people like us here on Twitter. Talking about the Wuhan lab leak. And now I mentioned earlier we had not talked about it for a long time because we know what happened. But I thought the WIV-15 was one of those things that kind of was called back into mind because of the polio thing. So we should mention it here as well. So the polio is WIV-14, the one that leaked in 2014. Because it's WIV-14, I was reminded, others were reminded of WIV 15. Oh, yeah, there was that WIV 15 as well. And WIV 15 is a virus that the Wuhan lab has been hiding ever since 2020. We know it exists because of the sequencing of the numbers, but we don't know what it is. We know that 13 is a SARS virus. We know because it's been published. We know that 14 is the polio. So the WIV doesn't necessarily mean just SARS or just Corona or just this or just that. It's just different
No.
viruses that they use for their experiments. But anyway, we know there's a 16. We know what that is, but the 15 has been missing. Now it may be nothing, or it may be the backbone of COVID, which they hid. We don't know, but the mere fact that they're hiding it and they're still hiding it is, again, tells us a lot. And again, I just mentioned that because of I think that whole WIV 15 story has kind of gotten lost in all the noise these past few years, and because WIV 14 leaked, it came back up into at least a smaller discussion online. And anyway, I think it's just another piece of evidence, and we now have more than enough. But I thought it was worth mentioning.
Yeah. I guess ultimately, at the end of the day, what this new information that they almost certainly leaked the polio vaccine before, couple that with the Kanema lab situation, which is a hell of a story unto itself, and then now COVID, is that it's Fouchier's email is prescient. Is if we expose this, it's going to call into question all the other lab leaks and outbreaks. Where did the outbreaks, and that's what we're getting to, is where did all these outbreaks actually originate? If they've covered it up this with this much effort, what other ones have they covered up in the past? And we already have a number of data points to show that it's happened repeatedly.
You're absolutely right. The fact that he used the word all
All,
is
all other.
that's just an extremely telling word to use there. And look, I don't know about every single outbreak. We've obviously named a few where we can be pretty sure that they came out of labs. Is AIDS? I haven't talked about AIDS yet. That's another one where you're dismissed immediately as a conspiracy
Yep.
theorist if you say that AIDS had anything to do with a lab, and I don't know that it did. But I've read very serious people making that argument. And by the way, AIDS has a very interesting parallel in terms of, I remember as a young kid, and there was this strange disease, and no one really knew what it was and so on. But there was this story going around that this was because people had sex with monkeys.
With monkeys.
That's what happened, right? That was the story. And it's just as racist as the story that, oh, Chinese people eat bats and therefore we got COVID. It's just that there's another little parallel there. That's not to say that AIDS came out of a lab. We don't know, but it's an interesting rabbit hole to go down, especially because there's a number of serious people who have made that argument quite persuasively. And then, of course, that leads to the big question here: is what recent outbreaks have not been like lab generated?
Yeah, I mean, others that fall into that category where we don't know factually, but we know serious people think that maybe it was the case. Lyme disease comes into play, Zika virus. You've already mentioned HIV. We know COVID, Ebola. We do know that can emerge naturally. But that outbreak, which was so devastating, appears not to have originated naturally. So again, I think it's the idea, we don't know everything yet, but there's sort of a reevaluation of these outbreaks that have emerged into human society over the last several decades, some of which have been absolutely debilitating. What was their true origination? That maybe it's not what you actually think. And it seems like these scientists seem to have believed the exact same thing.
And now that these viruses can be supercharged in a lab, it just makes the whole thing so much worse, so much more dangerous than it already was. And that, to me, is the biggest threat faced by humanity by a long, 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 long way. Far exceeding nuclear Armageddon and any other cause, climate change, whatever, all this stuff that's being put out there as being threats to humanity, absolutely pale in comparison to the real threat, which is lab-made viruses leaking intentionally or not, out of labs. That's the one biggest thing we're all facing, and hardly anyone talks about it.
Yeah, that a lab leak of a highly virulent virus is an existential threat to us.